This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to help understand a big story in the news. In this edition, as the government struggles to get to grips with coronavirus, we talk to an insider about how Downing Street goes into crisis mode. I've been talking to Chris Wilkins, who was Director of Strategy and Chief Speechwriter for Theresa May. In his time inside Number 10, he was part of the inner team which had to react to terrorist attacks in Manchester and London and the Grenfell Tower fire. I began by asking him what it felt like when the day job was suddenly interrupted by the unforeseen crisis.
Politics is all about the unanticipated events like we're facing at the moment, and we dealt with many of those. Terrorist attacks are sort of the obvious thing that I think of. I can remember, for example, the attack on Westminster Bridge, which was the first really big incident that we had to respond to. And when something like that happens, in a sense, the machinery of government changes. So day to day, government decision making and the way that government communicates is all done out through the departments. So all the departments across Westminster and Whitehall have their sort of own initiatives and their own agendas, and what you're doing in the centre is sort of trying to coordinate those things, but largely leaving the individual departments to sort of plough their own furrow. And then when a crisis hits, suddenly the centre, Number 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office by extension, then suddenly has to take charge and reach in and say, okay, we're going to take it from here. And that means a number of things. It means coordinating a series of policy meetings to drive the policy decision-making process, and the Prime Minister being absolutely at the heart of that. And those are the famous sort of COBRA meetings, which everyone gets very excited about. They're actually rather less exciting than people think.
Well, let's just pause on that though. You talked about coordinating with the Cabinet Office, and COBRA is Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. And for people who aren't familiar with it, the Cabinet Office is basically joined on to Number 10, for want of a better way of describing it. So it is almost like a continuous sort of centre of government at moments like this. And so with a terrorist attack, you mentioned Westminster Bridge, would the first thing be to say, right, we've got to get the PM to chair a COBRA? How would it work?
Yes, precisely. I think in that instant in particular, it is almost the default position that there is going to be a COBRA meeting, a meeting in the Cabinet Office in number 70 Whitehall, chaired by the Prime Minister, and pulling together, in that particular circumstance, obviously the heads of the security services and the Home Secretary and relevant ministers from across government.
And would that happen within an hour, 2 hours?
Literally within an hour. So in the case of Westminster Bridge, the moment that happened, I was actually being in a meeting in Parliament, walked out of the gates of Parliament and back to Number 10, and 20 minutes later this thing broke on the news that this had happened. Within an hour, Downing Street completely in lockdown straight away. The only people in or out were security service personnel. Within an hour, COBRA meeting convened, all of the heads around the table, and if not round the table, dialing in from wherever they might be.
When you say heads of services?
Heads of services, MI5, security services, and then people from relevant parts of sort of the Home Office, Foreign Office, and other parts of individual departments.
Can you give me an idea of what COBRA looks like? I mean, this is the sort of thing let's face it, quite fun to imagine.
Yes.
First of all, is it downstairs? Do you go down? Is it underneath the kind of complex of Cabinet Office?
So actually there are a series of different, as you said, COBRA is actually just the name of the room. It is in 70 Whitehall, which, as you say, is adjoined to Number 10 via a walkway. And it is actually a suite of different meeting rooms. It's at ground level and not anything like the sort of situation room that you might imagine from the United States. It's nothing like that. It's quite a plain room. Nothing, no sort of suite of monitors or anything of that nature. And indeed, I remember around that attack, in particular the Westminster Bridge attack, it wasn't a COBRA meeting, but it was a meeting in the Prime Minister's office, where the security service had some CCTV footage of the actual incident, and they came in with a laptop and this thing on a DVD and said, we're going to show you this thing, so it could be a bit gruesome, if so think about whether you want to watch it or not. And some of us decided, okay, well we will, and we crowded around the Prime Minister, huddled over this laptop, and of course the CD didn't work, and it tried to make it work and it didn't work, and at that moment you thought, it's not exactly the Situation Room, is it?
It's not the Bourne ultimatum.
It's not, so it's not that. So actually it's very prosaic in that sense, and that gives you a good sense of it. Actually, it is about having the right people there and getting the detail and being across the detail, and it's not about the sort of the gimmicks and the exciting sort of bits around the edge. It's about actually the decision-making process.
And that's the crucial thing for you then. As you were saying before, normally Downing Street is a lot of this. These decisions maybe are pushed out to the departments, but in the crisis, the value is Downing Street grabs control of everything. Is that correct?
Yes, I think absolutely, and that is both at a policy and decision-making level. What actually is the government's position on this, and what are the implications of that? Do we need to suddenly introduce new rules, legislation, whatever it might be? Thinking about that. And then at the second level, it is then, and then how are we going to communicate around this issue? So again, communications in an instance like this, absolutely vital, getting fast but also accurate information out, and at the same time monitoring for any inaccurate information that is out there being spread on the internet, which is the modern phenomenon we have to deal with. All of these things are crucial, and in these kind of instances, again, how do you build the central communications team that can actually make sure that that process is working very well? And many people argue that this kind of centralised decision-making structure should exist rather more in government day to day, and you hear lots of talk about what we actually need is a bigger Prime Minister's office, and there's a big sort of movement behind this, but it doesn't exist until incidents like this actually happen.
Okay, I mean, does that, and let's take a couple of steps back, I mean, when you talk about getting a communications team, does that involve physically moving a bunch of people, for instance, into one room, which is happening at the moment, for instance? So would that have been your experience as well?
Yes, so typically, precisely, you would get all of the key disciplines in one room around the same table, and that is everyone from the people who are doing the opinion polling to monitor what people are talking about and what people are saying, the sort of social media analytics and people who understand that world, what are people talking about online, and then your sort of communications strategists and your media handlers, all around the same table.
And they are stuck there, let's say, for days at a time, if that's what's necessary.
If that's what's necessary, absolutely. And it's the communications environment doesn't stop, so it can be 24/7 and constantly feeding in the inputs of what are people talking about out there, what's the digital media conversation going on, and then how can government then start to sort of impact upon that conversation and sort of correct narratives where they're incorrect, but also communicate important and vital information. And in the case of the terrorist incident I referred to, you have to act very quickly there, because in a terrorist incident, the reason people do these things often is because what they're trying to do is spark a broader narrative around sort of division and things like this. So they conduct a terrorist attack because what they want is for people to go online and start sort of sowing divisive narratives and things like this. In that particular instance, the strategic objective was stop that happening. And so you have seen at that point, the communication was all around actually, this was a one-off incident, this person hasn't won, we move on tomorrow, Parliament will sit, London will move on, etc., etc. It was cooling it down was the particular strategic objective there.
So you could do that because of the information you were putting out, but for instance, at this point I know that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, has had conversations with social media companies about fake news in this context of the coronavirus. I mean, there's only so much you can do to try and control that, isn't there?
There is, and this is, I think, going to become a really big part of the narrative about what happens with this virus, because obviously there's been an ongoing sort of conflict between government and social media companies anyway over recent years. In a nutshell, the social media companies want to say, we're not publishers, we're not in charge of the content that appears on our platforms, we merely provide a platform. And the moment they concede being publishers, then it leads to all sorts of bits of regulation that they have to adhere to. So they've been fighting that. In this incident, you've already seen that actually people like Facebook and others have come out and said, actually, we are going to start taking down content that is wrong. Now, that's great in this particular environment, and that is what they should be doing, but it has long-term implications for them as a platform and for their relationship with government. But I think the important thing to think about in this circumstance is there's two things. There's misinformation, and misinformation is typically, in government terms, defined as erroneous information, not malicious, but just where somebody is spreading something that's wrong out of ignorance or for no other reason. And then there is also disinformation. Disinformation in government terms is defined as proactively malign information that's being spread. So false narratives being spread by people deliberately with a broader agenda, whether that's to divide people in society or whatever it is, and that can often be hostile states or other organisations who are trying to spread that kind of thing. All of this is what government will be monitoring at the moment, trying to keep an eye on, and then thinking about how they respond to quickly.
And in a crisis situation like this, how important is your front man, or in your case, front woman? You work for Theresa May. Do you get them out front and centre a lot? Do you ration how often they appear? How does it work?
Yes, I think it's really important that they are out there at the key moments. So in the case of a terrorist incident, we talked about Westminster Bridge. So in that incident, Number 10 goes into lockdown, a COBRA meeting is called, and the Prime Minister goes into COBRA. And just before, if you're the speechwriter in Number 10, just before that happens, somebody turns to you and says, the Prime Minister's going into this meeting, it's going to be an hour, and when they come out, they're going to walk out into Downing Street and make a statement, good luck. And you have to sit down and think, my goodness, what are they going to say? And in that instant, what you're doing is trying to find the language which leads the nation's response, effectively. You are trying to capture the way that the nation is feeling and provide reassurance and all of these things and make sure you deliver the strategic effect that you've defined. In that case, reassurance, we move on, don't allow the person who committed this to be the hero of this incident.
It's a very important moment on which reputations can absolutely stand or fall.
Absolutely, and if you get that wrong, at an individual level, can be really damaging politically, and more broadly it can have really serious effects for the country. So these are big moments, and in this case we've seen Boris Johnson out there the other day flanked by the Chief Medical Advisor and others, and I think that went quite well. I think Number 10 felt that played off quite well, but actually since then they've been pushing the experts forward, and I think the Prime Minister will be used at the key moments, but actually it will be for the scientific advisors and others to lead the response. But what you can't afford to do is be absent as a political leader in things like this, and you've got to be constantly monitoring for that. It's a real balance. You don't want to make people more worried because suddenly you're out there all the time, but you can't afford to be absent either for all sorts of reasons.
I mean, Chico, I'm going to ask you, do you think the Prime Minister was a little bit too absent in the run-up to coronavirus? Would you, if you had been advising, would you say, I think we need to see a bit more of you, before we actually saw him at the press conference with the Chief Medical Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer?
I think maybe he might have appeared a little sooner. I think, interestingly, it was part of a strategic decision that Number 10 pursued, and actually when I was in Number 10, pursued a slightly similar tack, which is that actually after the David Cameron years, if I could put it like that, there was a sense, and this came through the polling and focus groups that was done, that actually the country was slightly feeling that we'd had this point of a PM being the commentator-in-chief, and actually they wanted the politicians to be rather more about getting on with the job and less commentary. So we, certainly with Theresa in the early months of her premiership, quite deliberately said we're not going to be doing the same thing, and so that's why she wasn't on social media so much and not out there so much. And I think this administration have made a similar calculation. They want very much the Prime Minister to be the chairman of the board figure and will appear at key moments, but actually delegating authority a lot of time to the Cabinet to do the job. But it's a really fine line about that.
And can I ask you about one where she didn't appear, which was after the Grenfell fire? I mean, was there a discussion about whether she should appear and make herself more visible at that point, or was there not? And with hindsight, how do you feel about that?
I mean, the context of that was obviously incredibly difficult. It was immediately after the general election of 2017, and to be completely honest, in that moment, the sort of number 10 machine was not operating at optimum capacity. To be honest, in the aftermath of that election, various people had left, the structures weren't there, etc., etc. And what actually happened there was that the advice from the authorities, from the police and others, was that actually for the Prime Minister to meet residents of Grenfell Tower at that point was not a good idea, because they feared for what would happen, because there was a lot of anger around. A political machine around that might have looked at that and said, well, politically that is very damaging, and she simply has to do this. But the political machine slightly sort of wasn't operating, as I say, because of the context, and we went with the advice, and it was, I think, very damaging to her reputation.
Okay, you said earlier that there was some view that what happens in the crisis in number 10, i.e. the kind of more centralised decision-making and communications operation, should happen basically always, and I think it's no secret that I think Dominic Cummings is on that wavelength.
Yes.
Do you think that should be the way to go outside the crisis situations?
I've always been an advocate of a stronger centre in government. This idea of there being a bigger Prime Minister's office. I think people would be surprised probably to learn how government is actually structured. Number 10 as a machine is quite small. The Prime Minister has a series of special advisors and a small civil service machine, but actually it has nothing compared to things like the Treasury and other departments, things like that, where the real sort of power lies a lot of the time, in a sense.
So someone like the Chancellor, in theory, has actually a lot more civil service, a lot more advisors than number 10, the Prime Minister.
A lot more. So actually, the centre in our political structure is not that powerful, other than when suddenly an incident happens. And I think creating a bigger Prime Minister's department that can really drive the Prime Minister's priorities over time is a vital thing that we should do. But as you say, Dominic Cummings is broadly in favour of it, but it has not really happened. And there is massive institutional pushback to that happening, because it goes against the grain of the way that we've run government for many years.
And is it also what's happening now with coronavirus? Is it a reminder maybe that you can have lots of ideas about how government should run, but when the chips are down, what people want government to do is get the fundamentals absolutely right and concentrate on those, and maybe some of the more imaginative thinking has just got to be shoved off into the distance, if I could put it like that. I mean, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, reality bites, doesn't it? And the government has a lot of, on a policy level, lots of big ideas of things it wants to achieve. But this is now going to dominate everything. It is, in that sense, the new Brexit. It is going to dominate everything for the foreseeable future. And that means that government is not going to be able to get its sort of narrative framing right that it wants to do, and not really get any momentum behind its agenda. And momentum is critical in politics. And the levelling up agenda is going to have to be sort of put to one side slightly now as they deal with this crisis. So that is a challenge. And at a structural level, I think it will be interesting to look back at this and learn the lessons of actually how government operates, and that actually in times of crisis like this, government operates quite well, but it operates quite well and it operates abnormally because it does centralise things, and day to day that is not how government is run.
And the trouble is, abnormally in this case, unfortunately, could last for months.
But then you also get a situation where, well, what happens when there are people in government who sort of aren't really involved in this? People who it doesn't necessarily impact on their brief, and there will be some, well, what are they doing whilst this is going on? And the answer is possibly not much, and there's already talk about Parliament not sitting and things like this. So it's potentially a really, really strange time where actually you end up with a core group of ministers dealing with it, a core group of officials dealing with it, But actually, the whole rest of government is basically at a standstill, and that's a strange dynamic.
People with some with idle hands ready to make some trouble potentially.
Potentially, and that's the thing, exactly. What happens in that circumstance when you've got people who really are in the day-to-day, in the centre of power, meeting in the Prime Minister's office every day, all of that sort of stuff, and then the outer ring who aren't. That's an interesting dynamic. Well, one of the things I always think about, about my time there was that Theresa May came into government and made a big thing about the return to cabinet government, and you'd had years of David Cameron's sort of sofa government, as it was called, which was sort of similar to the Tony Blair approach. And Theresa May said, we're going to have cabinet government, it's sort of grown up, etc., etc. And what we realised quite quickly was there was a reason that David Cameron had sofa government, because effectively he had a small team of people who made the decisions and tried to run things. And cabinet government is quite unwieldy, really. It's quite difficult to get things done and to respond quickly to incidents like this. So you end up creating almost an inner cabinet, in a sense, which gets things done, but what then happens to the people who aren't in that group?
Okay. Just to sum up, Chris, from what you saw in your time, from what you can see now, how does the UK government do in responding to crises? How do we measure up, say, against people we might compare ourselves to, the US, France, whoever it might be, Germany? I mean, what do you think? Do we do okay? How are we?
I think pretty good, actually. I think people would look at the way we've responded to some incidents, and I think terrorist attacks in particular, and think actually responded to those quite well. The messaging was good, and the policy response was right. I mean, the most recent incident we might think about is the Salisbury poisoning, the Skripal case. I think that was seen as almost a textbook example of how to respond to something like that, mobilising an international coalition, getting the communications around that right. People thought that was a really textbook example of how to do it. But the reason that worked was because government operated abnormally. They centralised things, and as I say, that is not how we operate day to day.
Chris Wilkins, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? Really, really interesting insights. And thank you.
Thank you.
Chris Wilkins, Director of Strategy and Chief Speechwriter to Theresa May, providing an insider's view of how Downing Street deals with a crisis. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for another podcast, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk. I'm tweeting on @AndyBell5News. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.